take our hearts and set them on fire. Amen. For the past 4 or 5 weeks, we have been hearing gospel stories that have all essentially been about one particular day. You remember that Jesus enters into Jerusalem, according to Matthew, overthrows the tables of the money changers, does some healing, and then leaves and goes out to Bethany for the night. On the next day, he returns. And every gospel reading we've heard for 4 weeks now has been what happens in that subsequent day, the day after the big overthrowing of the tables. And when he gets there to the temple the next day, the first thing the authorities do is come up to him and challenge him about his own authority. By what authority do you do the things that you do? And he says, well, what was the authority of John? And they duck that question, and he says, well, then I'm going to duck yours, and doesn't answer them in that moment. And then we have all these weeks of the exchanges between Jesus and the temple leaders and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, in which Jesus, in part, tells parables which suggest that the Pharisees have betrayed their trust, that God has given them to be stewards of God's graces, and they have done a lousy job of them. That's what the point of the parables are that we've heard. And then those same leaders challenge him with some questions. They ask him about taxes. Last week we heard them ask about taxes. They asked him about the resurrection. And all these questions are intended to trip him up, so that they can pigeonhole him, so that they can say, so this is the kind of Jewish teacher that you are. And he eludes their questions. And today comes the last question. And it's offered by a lawyer who says, which commandment is the greatest? Of course, there are 321 commandments or something like that. So there's a lot of commandments, and there was always discussion about which ones were the greatest in the debates between the rabbis. And Jesus' answer is, first commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like unto it, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and all the rest of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. And then he goes on to say, he turns the tables. Instead of them asking him a question, he asks them a question. Whose son is the Messiah? It's an odd thing he does. It seems like he's changing the subject. Whose son is the Messiah? And they say David's son. And they say, well then, and he says, well, if it's David's son, why does David call him Lord? So what's all that about? And they can't answer him that question. And then, interestingly, we are told they are silent, they're dumbfounded by his question, and they ask him no more questions. After this, there is no more dialogue with those leaders. The next chapter will be a long diatribe by Jesus against the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You remember those passages. And then after that, there'll be talk about the end times. But this intense exchange between the leaders and Jesus is drawn to a conclusion here. And it is bookended, this entire exchange, by first the question of authority. What authority do you have? And it bookended at the end with this question, with this response of Jesus. Well, who really is the Messiah. The Messiah is not somebody who gains his authority from the law, although we've been debating the law this whole long time. That's not where the Messiah's authority comes from. The Messiah's authority comes from God, and that supersedes the authority of David and his whole heritage. And so he comes to the end of this big exchange by saying, because there's been a very intense exchange between Jewish rabbis, by saying, well, you know, the debates that we've been having aren't the point. The point is that the Messiah brings something entirely new, beyond the law and the prophets. This is a new thing, not simply the outgrowth of an old thing. And then, since he's changed the playing field, as it were, they have nothing to say. If that's true, then what's the point of continuing the debate? If he is intimating that he is the Messiah and his authority, in fact, comes from well beyond the law and the prophets. But this last question that he's been asked is the way in which he answers all of the questions about the law. And that is to say, he says, what's the greatest of the commandments? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Such a simple little summary. Two different quotes from two different parts of the Old Testament, which are both commonly used by rabbis, although we don't have any evidence that anybody else has put them together in this exact same way, made them part and parcel of the same answer. And if you think about it, what does it really mean to love your neighbor? Doesn't it mean something like valuing your neighbor and their needs to the same extent that you value your own? Doesn't it mean that you will treat your neighbor in the kind of way that you want to be treated? Don't you think that it means that you will take into account his well-being and his beliefs and his needs with exactly the same amount that you take care of your own? We know how hard that is, because we're so deeply rooted in our own appetites. But to be able to value the neighbor in the same way that you value your own opinion, your own needs, your own wants, is what it means to love them. Because love is not a thing. You don't have love in the gospel. You do love. It's an act. So you can act that way. That's what it means to love your neighbor. It doesn't mean to wait for some nice emotion to come to your heart about loving your neighbor, because there are a lot of jerks around that if we wait for our hearts to be melted, we'll never love them. But we can act lovingly to them. We can be love in their lives. And that's what the commandment to love is. It's not about an emotion, it's about an action. And that's what it means when we value our neighbor's needs the same as we value our own. We can act on that and grow into it. No matter how hard we know it is. We know we're not very good at this. But that's the path that the gospel calls us to. And in the same way, that's what it means to love God. Because think about it. What does it mean to love God? Well, we all express wonder and thanksgiving to God with some more or less regularity. But what does it mean to love God? It means the same kind of action. It means to put into action the things that matter to God, the values that God and God's Son, the Messiah, has given us. That is, to love God is to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly. It is to do God's work in the world. To love God is not to say our prayers. It is not to even worship. Because worship and prayers really are for us. They're not for God. God doesn't care. What God cares about is whether we're doing God's kingdom in the world. And that's what it means to love God. There is this self-abandonment in both of these commandments. That is to give up our own narrowness in the world and to give ourselves to our neighbor and to give ourselves to God's agenda, to God's purposes in the world. And it's in that giving up of ourselves to them, to the other, that the kingdom is built in the world. And that's the best we can do, Jesus says. That's the summary of the law. And we never do it perfectly, and we never do it entirely. But that's the path that Jesus says is the path to this kingdom, which the Messiah brings.